guys. Well, welcome. We are excited to be here with you guys today. And before I start, this interview today, I want to just make a disclaimer that we're not here to cure, treat, prevent, mitigate disease. We are not here to, Ashley's kind of looking at me like, well, maybe we are.
I just kind of wince that, we have to say that, but that's true. I mean,
it's true. So. We definitely want to make sure that, what we're sharing with you guys today is of our opinion, and we are not your medical doctor. So just want to make that proper disclosure. So my branding girl made me say that, by the way. So for those of you guys tuning in that don't know me, my name is Jenny Crane, and I started my journey down the wellness path, a deep journey 10 years ago. I had my own chronic health condition that I was struggling with and was 30 years old at the time. And I thought, this should not be happening. Like, why am I so sick? Why am I not feeling well? And that was really my journey into going and diving into research. Ashley, thank you so much for being here with us today. You're a researcher. We respect and value you so much. And when I started uncovering the truth about the healing power of the human body, I was awakened. And it really I dove in, and I've been blessed over this last 8 years to be able to help people through chronic illness. Now vaccine injury is one of my biggest passions. And my passion is just to let people know that they have to trust in the healing power of their body. And we've been taught to walk away from that for a long time now. So I really dove deeper 2 years ago when my mother, I'm going to get emotional when I say this. My mom was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer. And walking through that journey with her and watching her have the faith to walk outside of the system to get help, I have to say that she's completely radically recovered from triple negative breast cancer out of the system. And walking through that moment with her really just empowered me more that there's so much more out there, and that we need to really educate people on the options that they have. So that's a little bit about my journey. I'm just a passionate mama that loves her kids, and I love to see people heal. I love to see people overcome challenges. And I'm so thankful that we get to hear from Ashley today, because I remember a girlfriend of mine reaching out last year and saying, oh my gosh, you've got to follow this girl online, Ashley Everly. And I'm like, who is she? So, I go online and immediately it was like, she's the real deal. Ashley, you are truly one of the most influential leaders in this movement of medical freedom. And we're just thankful that you are passionate about speaking the truth, doing your research. So you guys, Ashley received her Bachelor's of Science in Toxicology from UC Davis, and she's currently working as a consultant for the nonprofit organization Health Freedom Idaho. Her son's vaccine injury propelled her to investigate the medical literature on vaccines, on natural health, nutrition, and vaccine safety. What she found motivated her to create a free online resource guide called the Vaccine Guide, which we're going to be getting you guys the plug to that and how to order that. But her goal is to primarily provide true informed consent to parents and individuals who are trying to educate on vaccines. So we're thankful that you're here, Ashley. Thank you so much for taking this time away from your family to be with us and bless us today with this information. So if you can just start by telling us, a little bit more about your credentials and your story and what really propelled you down this path, we're excited to hear from you.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for your kind words, by the way. It's always hard for me to know how to respond to that, because this is something that I just found myself doing. I had no idea that this would be my internal calling, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I got my Bachelor of Science in Environmental Toxicology, and the only reason I went that direction was because I found it so fascinating. The study of poisons and how toxins can affect the body and how our body works to detoxify those incoming threats. So, but yeah, vaccines weren't on my radar until I was pregnant with my son, my firstborn. So, and my mom gave me the Dr. Sears book, the vaccine book. And I hardly knew anything about vaccines. I'm actually looking back kind of shocked that, I took a class called Toxicology in Industry, and not once did we learn about vaccines. So looking back, that's really frustrating for me because, I mean, I did an entire presentation on the drug Singulair and how it affects the body and how some people are susceptible to these, you know, neuro enhanced effects. And anyway, so didn't learn anything about vaccines, got the vaccine book, started looking at the ingredients, was just blown away. And at that point, I didn't even know that there was aborted fetal tissue used in vaccine development. I was mostly focused on the aluminum. So when I tried to get my son vaccinated, I still believed in vaccines at the time. I hadn't really spent enough time in the research to know everything that I know now. Any mother can attest to this, that the amount of information out there is beyond overwhelming. I mean, it's just, where do you start? You know, how do you figure out what information is factual and what information is not? Yeah, of course, you're going to have parents and people saying, you know, don't listen to mom blogs, and, you know, these are just conspiracy theories, and don't use YouTube videos as your, don't use YouTube videos as your evidence or your research, right? Well, you know, coming from a scientific background, all I did was go to the medical research. And if someone sent me an article, I would look immediately for the sources. Where are the sources? Where's the research? And so, yeah, but that wasn't until after my son was vaccine injured. So I went and I decided I wanted to get him the pertussis vaccine, to get him vaccinated for whooping cough. And, you know, he was 4 months old, so I delayed until 4 months. But looking back, I actually think he was given Hep B in the hospital against my wishes. And I also think that happened with my daughter as well. But I've heard of that happening many, many times. So I just wouldn't be surprised at this point. But going back, you know, I, at the time, was a little worried about whooping cough because there was an outbreak. It was 2011. People were worried. So I asked my doctor, you know, if there's any vaccine that you would recommend, what would you do? And he said, whooping cough. And I kind of felt the same way. And so I was like, okay, I'll go forward with it. And I asked the nurse, do you have a DTaP only vaccine? She said, yes. She kept pressuring me. He really needs to have rotavirus. He really needs to have this. He really needs to have that. And I said, you know what? I really just want to get DTaP only. And kept rolling her eyes at me. Eventually she came back, gave him the shot. A month later I went back because I was trying to selectively and delay, space out the vaccines. And I found out he was given Pediarix, which is DTaP, Hep B, and polio. And that was the one vaccine I was trying to avoid because in that Dr. Sears vaccine book, it goes over the amount of aluminum in each vaccine. And he says very clearly, you know, you want to avoid the ones with the most aluminum. If you're going to give your child a vaccine, at least get the ones that have less aluminum. Pediarix is the one that has the most aluminum of any other shot in existence, in license for use right now. So, so anyway, that was, you know, that was shocking for me. And just to have that decision taken away from you, you know, as a parent it's just happened to so many parents. So after that, you know, I was still worried about certain vaccine associated diseases or infections. And I continued to vaccinate him here and there, to maybe when he was around 2 years old is when I stopped, but he only got about, I think, 13 total vaccines. Whereas, you know, most kids get so many more than that by the time they're age 2 at this point. But anyway, he just had all these developmental delays. He had basically all the signs and symptoms of autism on kind of a mild to moderate level, depending on the symptom. And it was something that I just couldn't shake within myself. You know, like, something's wrong. This is not right. Like, I didn't have any health issues as a kid. You know, I don't remember having developmental delays or my mom saying anything about this. I don't, you know, this is just not sitting right with me. And, you know, as a mom, you have this intuitive sense, you know, like something's just not right. And so propelled me to dive in more to the research. And by the time my daughter was born, a couple years later, when my son was a little over 2 years old, that's why I stopped, because I said, you know, I'm having another baby. I need to know for sure, you know, how I feel about this. What's the truth about this? You know, I don't want to just be making a decision based on fear. So yeah, so
I always like to call it the rabbit hole, because once you start digging, you know, you're uncovering, you know, fact after fact. And what I appreciate about you, Ashley, is that you really know what's science and what's not, right? And that's what I've noticed in following you, is that you're really searching for those sources. For those of you, of the people that are watching this, you know, that are brand new to this whole topic, will you just explain to them what the difference in the vaccine schedule looks like compared to, you know, back in the 80s? Like, how many vaccines by the time a child is fully grown and developed do they have compared to what that used to look like, you know, 5, 10, because this is one of the foundational ideas.
Right. Definitely. So when I was a kid, we received around 24 doses of vaccines by the time we were 18. And that has, you know, ever since the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, that has tripled. So and around the age of 18, I think you get 69 to 70 doses of vaccines, which, you know, so a lot of the older generation just doesn't understand that, you know, yeah, we might have gotten some vaccines back in the day, but now it's like, gosh, it's this onslaught of injections every few months, it seems. So
yeah, and then you include the flu shot on top of that. So I don't know what that makes the number. I know it goes up definitely compared to how many years they're vaccinating for that.
Right.
What specifically is the detriment of vaccines? You know, what's in the vaccines that's most dangerous to the human body?
So, you know, I would say that there's probably 3 ingredients that are typically the ones that people focus on. And that would be aluminum, mercury, and then the aborted fetal cell DNA. Besides that, you have polysorbate 80. And some people are concerned about the formaldehyde content of these vaccines, considering it is, you know, listed as a probable carcinogen, I believe. So, but the thing that I focused on for myself, based on my own son and his, you know, my experience with the vaccines he received, I focused heavily on the aluminum. You know, there's this bioinorganic chemist, I'm sure you've heard of him, Chris Exley from Keele University in the UK, and he has been studying aluminum toxicity for 35 years. And, you know, numerous published papers on the toxicity of aluminum, specifically neurotoxicity. And gosh, the amount of research that is out there is mind-boggling for the CDC and our pharmaceutical companies to continue using aluminum in vaccines. It's mind-blowing. So yeah, the aluminum in vaccines is definitely toxic. It's, you know, there's so much research out there looking at the specific dose that a child will receive. And over the certain, you know, over the first year or first 6 months of the child's life, you know, how does that compare to, let's say, the amount of aluminum in breast milk? That's something that a lot of pro-vaccine advocates will say, well, you know, a baby gets more aluminum in their breast milk, and, you know, so the amount of aluminum in vaccines is negligible, you know, compared to that. Well, again, you have to go back to the route of exposure. You know, that's one of the first things that we learn in a toxicology course, is that the toxicity of a substance is dependent upon not only the dose, yes, the dose makes the poison, like everybody says, but also the route of exposure. So that's the thing that most people who believe in vaccines are not understanding when they look at that aluminum argument. So the amount that's injected, based on the absorption rate, you absorb all of the aluminum that is injected into the body. Versus
that's the concept behind injection versus ingestion,
yes.
Right? Is that what you're, okay.
Yeah, and so when you ingest the aluminum through breast milk as a baby, you know, you're only absorbing 0.1 to 0.4% of that aluminum compared to 100%. So you have to factor that absorption rate in, and it makes a huge difference. So the amount of aluminum you're getting in the vaccines is, that you absorb into the body is way more, way more than what you would get, as a nursing infant through breast milk. So, and that, aluminum causes so many problems with the neurological system. I mean, we know now that we wouldn't have Alzheimer's without aluminum, and all that neurodegeneration and, we see that happening in the elderly. Well, it's happening in our children too, because they're developing, and during these critical neurodevelopmental phases in their life, they're being injected with neurotoxins that damage the growth of these areas of the brain. And then we wonder why, we have aluminum studies which have found that it gravitates towards a certain part of the brain. And then we have autism studies that have found that this particular part of the brain is most damaged and tends to be damaged in autism. And then we're injecting aluminum into our children, and that the rate of autism is skyrocketing. It's just, it's like, can we put 2 and 2 together here? Can we just, look at the research and have some common sense? So, and no, just because it's an aluminum salt does not make it safe. So, but I could go on and on about all of this stuff. I don't want to take up too much time.
Go on and on. I think, we're sitting here in quarantine. Who best can we hear from about this topic? So let's do it, sister. I love that you touched on injection versus ingestion. For anybody that's watching this, learning about this for the first time, definitely do your research on that. Let's talk about the polio vaccine, because that's one of the biggest things that I hear people saying. Well, polio was eradicated from the planet. Thank God for the polio vaccine. And let's talk specifically about SV40, and why the polio vaccine isn't what people think it is. So I guess we can start there with that, because I know we can do a whole hour a subject or topic on just the polio vaccine. So
sure. Yeah. So the polio vaccine, I'll touch on the SV40. The polio vaccine uses monkey kidney cells to grow the polio virus in order to make the vaccine. So one of the first polio vaccines that was used or licensed for use in the US actually was contaminated with a virus from those monkey cells. Basically, SV40 stands for simian virus 40, number 40. So they found in a lot of different research studies that certain brain cancers, they found this SV40 virus within these cancers and these tumors in the brain. And so, I mean, that right there is just, it's astounding, because we're using cells from animals or humans with the aborted fetal cells, and we can't exactly purify it the way that it needs to be purified to completely get rid of all of the other viruses that may also be in the solution. So that right there, if you haven't heard about that before, that is an actual thing. There's research on this, that SV40 has been found in tumors of brain cancer, and that SV40 was in the polio vaccines. So of course they've changed the polio vaccine since then. However, going back to polio just in general, and so many people use polio as an example for why vaccines work. Why vaccines are just the most wonderful miracle of all medical advancement, right? So back in the 1950s, when we were having all these polio outbreaks, it's a lot like what we're seeing now. Okay, we had people panicking. We had, I wasn't alive then, but we had people freaking out. They weren't going to public pools. They were worried about their kids catching this virus, okay? Now, at the time, all of these doctors were actually getting financial compensation from the federal government when they had polio cases in their practices. So right there, you have a financial incentive to diagnose polio. Not only that, but they did not have to actually test to confirm for polio when they diagnosed a child with polio.
Sounds familiar.
Yes, very familiar with what's going on today with coronavirus. So they did not have to test. And so what happened was at the time, you know, polio symptoms could have been a temporary muscle weakness. So if you had, you know, cold symptoms with a little temporary muscle weakness in your arm or leg, that's polio. You could recover in a week, have no more muscle weakness, and that would have still been documented as polio. But, you know, people nowadays, when they think of polio, they think of, you know, permanent paralysis in an iron lung. Okay. So, but that wasn't the case. When you hear about polio being this horrible, horrible disease and how we eradicated polio, well, this is what happened. We had so many children getting polio, but it was temporary muscle weakness. Then once the polio vaccine was introduced and became widely adopted or widely used, all of a sudden now the rules changed. They had to change the diagnostic criteria. Okay, they all of a sudden had to test, had to do an actual test to confirm whether or not the virus was present. So what ended up happening was that cases of reported polio continued to increase even in some areas because the polio vaccine actually could cause polio, for one thing, or paralysis just in general, maybe not polio. What'd you say?
I said that's the dirty little secret. I was going to bring that up next.
Right. So the vaccine itself could cause paralysis, which it is now doing in other countries in the developed world or underdeveloped world. So what ended up happening was that the reported cases may have increased or stayed the same, but you have the confirmed cases where they actually had to test. Those were the ones they used, and those were the ones that dropped. What ended up happening was during the same time period, they started realizing, wow, there's actually other viruses that can cause polio-like symptoms. So you have transverse myelitis and Guillain-Barré syndrome and aseptic meningitis. All of these cause same or similar symptoms as polio. And so prior to the vaccine being introduced, all of those were also diagnosed as polio. And when you actually look at the peak of the epidemic of polio, in 1952, I did all the math and the numbers, and basically back then, you know, we're led to believe that people were dropping like flies, you know. But what the reality of the situation was that the polio in 1952, at the height of the epidemic, like I said, was affecting 0.03% of the population. So nowadays, when you look at aseptic meningitis, transverse myelitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and you calculate what's the percentage of our population now that has those and is diagnosed with those every year, it's nearly identical. It's like 0.027%. Okay. So what we did was we renamed polio and we stopped scaring people via the media, via our government. And people took a vaccine and believed that this was magic, basically.
Yeah, you know, when they first start, let's talk about the dirty little polio vaccine secret. I like to bring this up because people are so unaware as to the difference between the VAAP and the IPV. So going from the oral version, the oral version, which is what, by the way, Bill Gates gave to all the kids in India, was the oral version of the polio vaccine. So can you explain why they stopped giving the oral polio vaccine in the US and then moved over to the injection, you know, to the injection form of the polio vaccine?
Yeah, so the oral polio vaccine is a live virus vaccine. And so it was actually causing many cases of polio. It was paralyzing children. So they ended up going to the inactivated IPV polio vaccine here in the US, but they continued to give the oral polio vaccine in developing countries. So, and that's what they're finding. You don't really find this here in the US, this information, but in Indian news sources, you will find articles saying that, gosh, we had this, influx of polio vaccination. We had this polio vaccine campaign come in and vaccinate, 40,000 people. And then what happens months later? We have this, outbreak of paralysis across the country. And there's scientific research that linked that polio vaccine, the oral polio vaccine, to paralysis.
Yeah, it's one of those things, you get a man that's trying to save the world with his vaccine agenda, going over and practicing medicine without a medical license. To me, that's a big problem.
He calls himself a health expert.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it's one of those things that until people start waking up and understanding the brevity of the situation, things aren't going to change. But that's why we're here today, guys. So by the way, if you guys are watching this, share this replay with everybody that you know. Let's talk about the MMR vaccine. One of the biggest arguments as well in the pro-vax movement is, why aren't we dying of the measles anymore? Like this is, the MMR vaccine has wiped this out of population. So what is the biggest misconception there with the MMR vaccine, which we know is one of the most, linked to vaccine injury, by the way. So. Yeah,
there's a lot. I've done a 2.5-hour presentation on just measles and the MMR vaccine alone, and it still wasn't everything that I could have shared on it. So I'll try to go quickly, but
we'll have to do a part series to this interview, maybe all about the MMR.
Okay. So first you have measles wasn't an issue in the 1960s, guys. It just wasn't. The whole point of the MMR vaccine or the measles vaccine back then was because they were excited to accomplish this goal of eradicating disease. So it was this scientific achievement that they were going for. And they thought that, gosh, if we could just get 60% population vaccinated, we'd have no more measles, we'd eradicate all disease, this would be amazing. Didn't happen. Okay. Not just that, but a lot of people still, even in 1969, you have this Brady Bunch episode where all the kids get measles. Okay. That was 6 years after the vaccine was introduced, by the way, but all the kids get measles in the Brady Bunch episode, and the kids are, it's the running joke of the show. They're not scared, they're saying, hey, if you got to get sick, you sure can't beat the measles, stay home and don't have to go to school for a week, So it was nutrition. It was primarily vitamin A sufficiency that reduced the death and morbidity, even like the incidence of measles even. Okay. Because there's scientific research that not only shows that vitamin A sufficiency reduces the complications and death from measles, but the incidence, whether or not you actually even contract measles. If you are vitamin A sufficient and you're otherwise not malnourished, right, you might not even contract measles if you're exposed because your body's not susceptible to it. So we have this major decline before the vaccine of death from measles. In 1960, it was your risk of dying from measles if you lived in the US was 1 in 500,000. So that's how low your risk was of dying of measles. And every year there was about 5 million people who contracted measles in the US out of a population of 180.7 million. So it's not like without the vaccine, we would have all of the population contracting measles. No, we only had a very small percentage of the population actually contract measles, even before we had a vaccine. And the good thing was that all of those people can, almost all of them, the very few, yes, some died. That is going to be how it is with every infectious disease that has ever been in existence. There's always going to be someone who's susceptible, and, you can't eliminate that, I don't think, but it was near zero. before the vaccine. Okay. So, but then everybody else who contracted it gains natural immunity, lifetime immunity, and it protects everybody else. So anyway, we introduced this vaccine that is almost pointless, in my opinion, almost pointless. They were, running off this steam of the polio vaccine, and everybody was excited to be able to eradicate infectious disease. Well, again, you have a change in diagnostic criteria. The MMR vaccine causes symptoms of measles 5% of the time, documented in the research, causes the very exact same symptoms of measles. And in order to distinguish between live measles, wild type measles versus vaccine measles, they have to do genotype testing because they can't determine based on symptoms, same symptoms, right? So basically, you're getting measles from the vaccine 5% of the time, but the doctors don't label that or document that as measles, okay? So how many people over the years how many children have gotten measles basically from the vaccine, but it's not documented as measles? Probably thousands and thousands, because you get, or more than that, because if you have 10 million people getting the MMR vaccine every year, 5% of 10 million, that's a lot, okay? Not documented as measles, okay? Then you have, the MMR vaccine. Gosh, yes, it's a live virus vaccine. It uses human aborted fetal cells in the development of the vaccine and the manufacturing of the vaccine. So now you're getting fragments of DNA from that aborted fetus into your body, which has not been tested for mutagenicity or carcinogenicity by the vaccine manufacturers themselves, nor the CDC. Okay, they're like, no, we don't test for this. Oh, well, if this DNA from this aborted fetus is injected into your body and then causes this immune response, and I mean, you'd think we'd want to know what happens, when we do something like that. But the only people that have really looked into that, Dr. Teresa Deischer, she is known for, she discovered adult human stem cells. Okay, so she's not just some everybody says that, not everybody, but a lot of people who support the vaccine program are saying, well, these people who publish studies on vaccines being harmful, they're just quacks. No, she's not a quack. Okay, she's very intelligent, spoken before Congress. I mean, she, like I said, discovered adult stem cells. She found that when you basically inject, she didn't do this in a human being, but basically she found that these fragments of DNA from the aborted fetuses used in the MMR vaccine production can actually integrate into the host DNA. So right there, it's like, well, gosh, this is mutating. This has the potential to mutate our DNA. And then, we have really no idea what the long-term consequences of that could be. So that's some of it, but ultimately when I compared the adverse event rate from measles back before the vaccine was introduced to the adverse event rate of the MMR vaccine now, my own calculations, I have a post on this on Facebook, by the way, is that we actually have twice as many adverse events happening from the MMR vaccine now as opposed to the measles virus back in 1960.
Can you explain a little bit deeper as to what that looks like, the shedding aspect of the vaccine? And not only that, to me, understanding the power of the immune system in this whole deal is so important. We're hijacking our body's immune response when we're injecting these vaccines into our kids. And a lot of the times that's how our body builds immunity, right? Getting childhood diseases to protect down the road against things like cancer and, adult onset diseases that come with aging, oxidative stress, and all of those things. Can you explain how radically this is affecting now the cancer rate? Let's just look at cancer. I mean, we can talk about many different diseases, but it's radical. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, let me close this really quick. This is really bright. And then I'll get back in the chair here. The windows, like the sunlight came in. It was like in my face.
As I mentioned, it's going to be a longer interview, but stick to the end. You're going to want to hear it all. So stay with us.
Okay, so, right, there's studies that have found that when you contract natural wild type measles, that it reduces your risk of cancer later in life, especially as a child. So if you contract it as a child, then you have a reduced risk of cancer. Now this goes across the board for mumps, whooping cough, chicken pox as well. No, not just measles. If you contract all those other ones, you have a reduced risk of cancer. So that's something, you know, and we, sorry, my brain's going in a million different places right now. But so the other thing that some people may not know is that they are actually using measles as a therapy. Measles virus as a therapy for cancer in some instances. So, and there have been all these different case reports of people who had cancers. They went into remission after they contracted measles. And there's actually news stories of this back in the 60s where these children had these horrible diseases and there was no hope. And then they realized, oh my gosh, this child recovered after they got measles. And there's literally people searching for, hey, you know, who has measles? I need to get my child measles. And the child recovers. I mean, it's like, if we have this correlation, this connection, this, I mean, obvious benefit to contracting measles, like, what are we doing when we are trying to prevent ourselves from contracting measles? I mean, it's no surprise then, it shouldn't be, that, you know, childhood cancers have steadily increased since the 80s. I mean, that's scary. Cancer used to be something that only the very elderly developed. And now it's like, holy cow, children, infants. This is insane, right? I mean, it's not just cancer, like you said, it's all of these other chronic illnesses that children have these days. Like, for example, the Mmr vaccine causes chronic arthritis. And the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the federal government will compensate you if you have gotten the Mmr vaccine, or your child has gotten the Mmr vaccine, and then up to 42 days later, if you're diagnosed with chronic arthritis, then you can get financially compensated for that, because you cannot sue the manufacturer, of course. And the only reason they have that time limit on it is because they haven't done the studies to see how far out it can trigger chronic arthritis. So, but
well,
again.
I was going to ask this autoimmune question a little bit later in the interview, but I guess since we're talking about chronic illness and the fact that autoimmune disorders, you know, in general are on the rise, you know, people suffering from lupus, and gosh, I can go on and name 1,000 autoimmune, not 1,000, but a lot of autoimmune diseases. We know that it's on the rise. How is this whole vaccine agenda or program impacting the world of autoimmune disorders? Like, what is the biggest connection between autoimmune and vaccination?
Right. So I would say, in my opinion, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that vaccines can cause autoimmunity, I believe. But one of the biggest reasons we're seeing a huge increase in autoimmunity is due to the aluminum in the vaccines. There's a syndrome that has, like I said, there's so much research on this, called Autoinflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants. And the aluminum is used in vaccines as an adjuvant. And what is an adjuvant? An adjuvant is intended to provoke the immune system. Because when you have a vaccine that is using a dead virus or an inactivated virus, it's not a live virus, well, then the body does not really look at it the same way, right? It doesn't react to the virus as these vaccine scientists want it to. They want the immune system to kind of pounce on the antigen within the vaccine and then go through the motions that, you know, we're supposed to go through. Well, what we have is the immune system's not responding. So what do? We use aluminum or another adjuvant but around, I want to say 60% of the vaccines we currently use today have aluminum as the adjuvant. The pertussis, the DTaP and Tdap vaccine, the HPV vaccine, pneumococcal, Hib, all of those vaccines use aluminum, different amounts of aluminum. But basically, the reason why the immune system reacts is because aluminum is toxic. The immune system is properly identifying aluminum when it is injected into the body as harmful. And that is why the immune system responds and says, oh my gosh, we have to do something. Otherwise it wouldn't do anything, right? So you have to have, and even the World Health Organization recently said that, this is the tricky thing with adjuvants because, the whole point of an adjuvant is to provoke the immune system. And the only reason it would provoke is because it's harmful. It's identified as toxic or harmful. So this autoimmune autoinflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants there's this huge field of study on it. Different researchers and scientists and experts in rheumatology and aluminum toxicology and autoimmunity in general are looking at the fact that when you inject a vaccine which contains aluminum into like your arm, let's say, that aluminum can stay there and remain at the injection site for years. Years as your body and your white blood cells, your macrophages try to encapsulate, engulf, or attack, or try to get rid of that particulate aluminum that's now being deposited in your muscle tissue, saturated in blood, and then, transported around the body. Well, some people even get like this nodule on their arm, which is basically indicative of that aluminum that is trapped there at the site. But what's happened is that a lot of these people they develop autoimmune syndromes like chronic fatigue syndrome or rheumatoid arthritis, or fibromyalgia or multiple sclerosis. I mean, there's a lot of other ones as well that don't necessarily have to do with muscle pain and inflammation, or ligament and, tissue inflammation, irritable bowel diseases, inflammatory bowel diseases, and thyroid autoimmunity, inflammation of the heart, myocarditis. All of these things have been linked to the aluminum getting injected into the body. They've not only done studies where they've biopsied the arm to see if the aluminum was there like 10 years later. Okay, yes, 10 years later, but they've recreated this phenomenon in a lab. So it's like there's no denying that this is happening. I mean, there is a hospital in, I think, France, where they are treating like 600 people. And the only reason they're treating that many people there, and the only reason we don't have hospitals here treating people, is because they know about it there. They know about it, right? And so this is just, I mean, we have this explosion of autoimmunity in our population. I mean, it's just, I mean, I had autoimmune disease. I had thyroid autoimmunity, right? And I'm still working through it, and I've recovered quite a bit from it, and I've reversed almost pretty much all my symptoms. But, it's aluminum is in everything, right? It's like we're exposed to it in so many ways, and it's no wonder that, younger and younger and younger individuals are developing autoimmunity when they're being injected with something that causes their immune system to try to attack the aluminum. What happens in, what I'm seeing happen and what I believe is happening is that this aluminum is getting deposited in cells. And then you have the immune system identifying and recognizing, gosh, like, if we have this aluminum in this tissue, in this cellular tissue, it's compromising the function of this cell. And so while it might otherwise look healthy, the immune system's identifying, gosh, this cell needs to go. It's not working correctly. There's aluminum in it. It's toxic. We got to get rid of the aluminum. In order to get rid of the aluminum, the cell is killed, basically, ripped apart, right? And so it looks like the immune system's attacking healthy cells.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that's happening for a moment. I don't believe it's happening. We have this amazing biological system. And when you give it the right fuel, when you eat healthy, when you reduce your stress, when you sleep well, and I mean, it's like the body's a miracle. Okay. So I don't believe for a moment.
That, sister. Let's get everybody on this chat that believes the body's a miracle. Drop immunity in the chat. Body is a miracle. I love it. You said it perfectly. I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, and let's talk. I know I didn't think I was going to bring this up, but I think it's important for people to understand the majority of the population that suffers with methylation issues. I mean, you're talking about these, factors coming in and just adding to the toxic load inside of the body. And then you have 40 to 50% of the population who genetically is predisposed to not being able to detoxify on top of that. Right. So considering, injecting let's just say a person that's DNA is perfectly presented with the idea that it can detoxify and methylate properly. Well, you have 40 to 50% of the population that has some sort of Mthfr gene mutation, and they can't methylate properly, right? They cannot detoxify heavy metals, and we don't even need to go into the science behind that. That's a whole other, we could do another topic on another, interview on that. But can you just give us an overall idea of how that impacts most of the population?
Right. So the very basic, idea of this is that you have this gene called the MTHFR gene. And what MTHFR stands for is methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. And so when you take in folic acid, that gene converts to an enzyme. And what happens is this enzyme is supposed to bind to folic acid, supposed to convert it to folate. And then the folate is used for, a wide variety of things. But one of the big things that it's used for is glutathione production. And glutathione is our major detoxifying molecule. When you look at, phase 1, phase 2 detoxification in the body, glutathione is just very, very important. So it's a major antioxidant as well. We hear about vitamin C being an antioxidant, but glutathione is super antioxidant, okay? So, and you don't, just a side note, you don't really want to take glutathione itself because it will reduce, it's like a negative feedback. So it will downregulate your own production of glutathione. You want to take a precursor to glutathione like N-acetylcysteine, which helps boost your own body's natural production of glutathione. Side note. Perfect. So, but what happens is when you have someone who has a gene mutation or defect on the MTHFR gene, and there's, a couple different MTHFR genes that or SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that we are more aware of and we have done more research on. The MTHFR, the gene that we have really looked into is the C677T, and then there's also A129HC. That's a lot of details you don't really need to know, but you can look into it. I found out my son has 2 copies of the C677T mutation, which basically means that his capacity for detoxification is very, very low. Because what happens is, like I said, this gene that converts to the enzyme, you need the enzyme to fold a certain way. It kind of folds in on itself based on the chemistry of this, this structure. And it needs to be able to bind folic acid, like I said, to convert to folate. Well, what happens is when you have the mutation, it just doesn't fold right. And so a significant portion of the time, it can't bind to folic acid to convert it to folate. Now, if you have one gene mutation on this SNP, then, you'll still be able to, fairly well convert folic acid to folate, but maybe 60% of the time, right? When you have 2 mutations, it cuts it down to 10% because it just doesn't work very well. And so you have down the line, you have much less glutathione being produced by your body. And so when you're injected with toxics, you're not able to detoxify what you're being injected with, or what you're ingesting, or what you're getting on your skin, or what you're breathing in. So like my son, he was way more susceptible to vaccine injury. And even though he only had, gosh, like I said, maybe 13 vaccines, it really affected him. I mean, it really did. He ended up with food intolerances and allergies and, speech delays, neurodevelopmental delays. I mean, he had chronic stomach pain, tics, like all kinds of things. Okay. I mean, a long, long list, eczema. I mean, I can't remember the whole thing because it's been several years now, thankfully, and we've recovered him dramatically. But this is why you have kids that are seemingly totally okay when they get a vaccine. They don't seem to show any symptoms. Now, that's not to say that they are not being harmed internally, because unfortunately, regardless of whether or not your body is more capable of detoxifying and excreting out that aluminum or the mercury or whatever, it's still causing damage along the way. You still end up with some deposited aluminum or mercury within the body. And over time, that begins to accumulate. Bioaccumulation, okay? It's basically the entire reason why the elderly have more health issues, because they've accumulated more over their many years of life, right? And that's why it's so concerning that we have children having autoimmune diseases and cancer, because they're accumulating so much more at an earlier age. Okay, so like I said, that's why some babies seem to do okay, and then some babies literally just die in their sleep days later or the same day. And it's insanely tragic and heartbreaking, and it shouldn't be happening. But yeah, I hope I explained that MTHFR thing well.
You absolutely did. And it was probably about a year ago that I put the pieces together regarding, SIDS and the whole idea behind SIDS. And, we've actually have many parents that have come forth telling their children stories, their babies getting vaccinated, and then 24, 48 hours down the road, they don't wake up after a nap. And this is happening. I get the chill. I get, my heart breaks when I hear these things. And, I guess this is a good time to start talking about the Vaccine Injury Act. I know many people that are watching this probably don't know about the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act that was put into play. I guess we can start there.
Sure. Yeah. So in the mid-1980s, the federal government passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. Why? Well, the DPT vaccine was in use back then. Now, the one we have now is DTaP, right? The acellular pertussis vaccine. We used to have the whole cell pertussis vaccine, DPT, back then, or DTP, depending on how you want to say it. And what was happening back then in the early 80s is that so many children were being harmed, were being injured and killed, and just permanently, paralyzed, debilitated by that vaccine, that these vaccine manufacturers were being inundated with lawsuits. And not just that, they were losing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, because it was like, how do you deny when you have a jury and they're hearing all of the evidence and they're hearing, my child was fine, totally normally developing child. They get this vaccine and then they start having 10 seizures a day. This is crazy, right? So this happened over and over and over again. Like I said, so much of these vaccine manufacturers were bowing out. They were like, we're not going to make vaccines anymore because we can't do this. It's too costly for us. And they just apparently did not know how to make them any safer. I don't know. So basically the vaccine manufacturers and our federal government at the time decided, well, we can't just get rid of vaccines, you know, so instead of the federal government saying to the vaccine manufacturers, you know what, it's your job to make them safer. It's your job to make sure that the product you're making is not killing babies and not giving them epilepsy for life and all of these other things, okay? Instead of doing that, they took away liability from the manufacturers and they put a tax on every vaccine that is given. And that money goes to a fund for anyone, any child who is injured by a vaccine. That fund is, you know, the federal government basically takes that money and gives that money out to people who are injured by a vaccine, but it's not, sorry, I just was looking at the comment, N-acetylcysteine, NAC, don't take glutathione, take NAC. Anyway, okay, so the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program is very difficult to win your case. You do have to petition. If your child's harmed by a vaccine, you have to file a petition with the vaccine court. And if your child's vaccine injury does not fall into this vaccine injury table as created by the Department of Health and Human Services, then you're going to have a very difficult time trying to win your case. And this vaccine injury table is, I mean, it's minimal. I mean, there's not much there. Like I said, there is chronic arthritis for the MMR vaccine. There is Guillain-Barré syndrome, you know, for the flu vaccine, and I think even the HPV, maybe the Tdap or DTaP vaccines. But, you know, you have a really hard road ahead if you want to try to receive compensation for your child's injury. And even then, even when parents receive compensation for their child's vaccine injury, it's like the government refuses to admit that the vaccine caused the injury. They still refuse to admit it because they do not want the vaccine industry looking bad. They don't want anybody to know about this, really. I mean, a lot of times these parents are under gag orders and they can't even talk about it if they get compensated. So over 2/3 of all petitions to the VICP are actually denied. And, you know, there's this whole thing back from way back when autism used to be compensated by the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And actually it still is, but they can't say autism. If they say autism, it's an automatic no, you don't get compensated because of the fraudulent CDC study on the MMR vaccine, which claimed that the MMR does not cause autism, or that there's no proof that it causes autism or not, which, you know, with the movie Vaxxed and that documentary, we found that, you know, clearly there was some bad actors there doing some things fraudulently to hide the actual data to cover up the fact that the MMR vaccine was correlated to an increased risk of autism. So there is so much fraud and so much corruption there. And, you know, there's no other industry like this. There's no other system, court system like this. And it's mind-blowing. So.
Before you go, I wanted to tell you about a brand new tool and freebie that I've created for you. It's a toxic load quiz that lets you know how heavy of a toxic load you're putting on your body. I believe that one of the first steps on your journey to better health is reducing toxins. After you take the quiz, you'll also get a free, simple guide to help you create a strategy for lowering your score. Head over now to jennytcrane.com/quiz and take the quiz today.